I think this was the last slide before we finished last week, and this will be the last occasion. And usually, if you have any question, please do not hesitate. And I have the feeling that 9 o'clock is a little bit too early to some of your colleagues, but that's probably normal in every university all over the world. So I'm proceeding with the planning procedure. And first of all, about regarding timing. If we are talking about the US budgeting procedure, it takes about 1.5 years. So there are countries where they are taking it really seriously. They are really going into the details and trying to plan in a very detailed way all institutions, all programs, all projects whatsoever. So there are countries where it takes much more than 1 year. US is probably the prime example. In case of Hungary, it's usually starting in the very old days. When I started my career, it started maybe September, and the parliament has approved the budget, let's say, in December, so it maybe took 2 months. But since that, from the beginning of the 90s, it's usually starting January, February, and the approval is expected in December. So usually 6, 7, 8, 9 months, depending on the size of the country, depending on the size of the budget, depending on the detailedness of the budget. So there is a lot of aspects. And of course there is one more element which is getting more and more important recently, that the macroeconomic scenario, which is the basis for the budget, sometimes is changing very rapidly. So when we are fighting with the crisis of Greece, when we are fighting with the crisis of Spain, EU, Hungary, Lehman Brothers and all the kind of stuff, sometimes it's very difficult to have a good budgetary planning system. For example, and that's the example, in 2008, actually in 1 month's time, the government has changed the GDP projection 3 times. They had an original one, and after that they have changed it twice, the GDP projection in 1 month. Of course, that was the autumn when Lehman Brothers actually collapsed, and they started their projection with probably plus 3% GDP growth. After that, 2 weeks later, they have reduced that for 1%, and 2 weeks later, they have reduced that to -1 or something like that. And at the end of the day, 1 year later, it turned out that the real figure actually was around -5, -6. So when you have such a fluctuation in the macroeconomic environment, it's very difficult to have a very good budgetary planning system and to really have an efficient one. Other big question is how much details we need. In Hungary, right now, the budget documents are about 900,000 pages. The budget itself may be 100 pages, all the other annexes. But if you want to see other countries, it very much depends that how much details the parliament is demanding from the government. In some cases, it's extremely detailed. So even almost every people who is paid by the government has almost a line in the budget. Maybe it's an exaggeration, but sometimes it's very, very detailed. And there are different levels of detailness. There are documents which goes to the parliament, or there are documents which goes maybe only to the government or to the ministry. And of course, the institutions itself, they might have their own budget. So at the different levels, there could be different structure and different level of detailedness of the budget, and that's changing from country to country. Of course, what was the main reason? What is deciding that how detailed is the budget? It's very much depend on that what the different decision-making levels are deciding about, and of course that's very much in line with the detailedness. So for example, in countries where the parliament, the congress, or the decision-making is actually dealing with all the details, so they want to approve every tiny detail of the budget. In that case, of course, they will request a very detailed budget. But there might be other countries where, for example, they would like to just decide about the main items, the ministries, the large institutions. So, for example, in countries where the parliament is approving every state university separately, of course they will request the figures like that. In that case, if they would like to just approve the totals for the universities, and they don't care about that, what the scientific or maybe economic university or education or health university, in that case they will not ask for the same details. So it usually depends on that who is deciding on what, and after that they are requesting more or less the same information, what is interesting for the decision making. Transparency. I already talked about that last week, and that's a big question mark that doesn't really help or not. In modern media time, I believe that sometimes too large transparency might hurt an efficient planning procedure, but otherwise, if everything is happening behind the scenes, there is a good chance that important issues are actually missed regarding the budget procedure. So somewhere in between, probably we have the good approach. Guarantees, contingent liabilities. I already talked about a lot last week that what kind of temptations the budget people and politicians are meeting actually every day, every week. So they would like to spend as much as possible, they would like to improve their opportunities to be re-elected, so that's always a temptation. And of course, it's quite easy to judge how much money they are spending next year when they are talking about the budget. But there are some ways how they can spend on the back of the future. So for example, they might take guarantees. It was quite common in some years, for example in Hungary, when the budget doesn't have enough money to spend, let's say, on local governments. The government told to the local governments, hey guys, easy to solve the problem. You can go to the banks, you can get credits, but of course their liquidity position was not that good and their financial stability, so they provided a state guarantee to the local governments. So banks were happy to actually provide the loan. Local governments could spend a lot of money, but on the central budget level, you didn't see anything. Maybe somewhere in the text part of the budget there was that the government is entitled to provide, let's say, 100 billion forint extra guarantee to the local governments, but there was no such extra spending line that's supporting the local governments. And it was clear from the first moment, it was clear from the beginning that these loans will be never paid back by the local governments. These loans will be paid, or would have been paid by the government. And actually that was the case later on. But via the guarantee, the government actually could hide some future expenditures. It didn't show up in the current year, but of course they could implement some extra spending, and later on the same government, or maybe an incoming government, had to pay back those loans, and it actually accumulated as a much larger expenditure. So when we would like to judge the quality of the budget, we actually have to see the contingent liabilities. I'm sure you've learned accounting principles and accounting maybe here or maybe at other universities. So in normal business accounting, it's clear that in the balance sheet and the P&L, you cannot really see the contingent liabilities, but there are principles that how you have to show that what kind of so-called below the line contingent liabilities you have. In the budgetary accounting, it's not that common. So in case of IFRS, that's one of the mostly used in Europe accounting principle. In the US GAAP, in the US accounting principles, that's usually somehow regulated, defined, how they have to show contingent liabilities in the financial accounts. In many cases, in the fiscal accounts, it's not that regulated, and it's not that clear that what kind of contingent liabilities the government has. It's much more difficult to follow. However, I mentioned that that's one of the way when they would like to spend on the back of the future and not showing up in the current budgets. And finally, the danger of the long-term commitments, I think it's quite obvious. That of course, if you are taking long-term commitments in very large amount, in that case, 2, 3, 4 years later, the budget will be in a serious trouble, and you have to pay back a lot of money, or you have to spend a lot, and you might have a serious problem. But I think that's not unique only in the fiscal system. Other big issue is actually when you are planning the different items, the different lines, that what kind of methods you are using. One of the main danger, but usually used to mention regarding budgetary planning procedure, is the indexation mechanism. Of course, if you are talking about anti-inflationary policy, probably in the top 3 danger of inflation, but maybe on the top of the list usually you will find the indexation mechanism. When in a country indexation is getting really common, in case of wages, in case of pensions, in case of service price, in case of family allowances, in that case you have a real danger of serious inflation. Italy, which was famous during the 70s and the 80s about the high inflation, very much used to the indexation mechanism, and mostly in case of wages. That's usually treated as the most dangerous part of anti-inflationary policy. And usually pensions are those items where indexation is actually still common and still accepted by almost every country. In Hungary, actually, we have an indexation system for the pensions for maybe 20 years or something. Sometimes it was corrected, sometimes it was changed, and there are different approaches. For example, in case of pensions, you might have an inflation which is relying on the current year inflation, or might rely on real wage growth in the economy. They might rely on maybe GDP growth, some kind of mix. So, for example, at the end of the 90s, 2000, the so-called Swiss indexation was applied in Hungary, which means that 50% of the weight was inflation, 50% was real wage growth in the economy, so a kind of mix was applied in case of pensions. But you might invent a number of other indexation mechanisms, but that's many cases accepted by the society, because pensioners has no real effect on the economic performance. They cannot really protect themselves against inflation, that in case of pension some kind of indexation is needed. Otherwise, I don't think that's a very good idea to have indexation mechanism in the budget, because first of all, it would endanger the stability of the fiscal accounts, it would reduce the flexibility of the fiscal policy. Of course, teachers, doctors, nurses, civil servants, public servants probably have a different idea. But when we are talking about fiscal policy flexibility, the less indexation is probably the better. But there are different approaches all over the world. There are countries where they have indexation mechanisms. There are countries where it's a usual bargaining procedure between the trade unions, for example, and the state. There are countries where these bargaining procedures are actually leading to agreement between the trade unions and the state, and sometimes it has, for example, 2, 3, 4 years agreements between trade unions and the state, that what kind of wage increase the different classes of the public sector might expect. So, for example, there is an agreement that doctors might expect a 5% wage increase for the next 5 years. They have an agreement, and after the next 5 years, budgetary planning is easy because you have to calculate with the 5% wage growth. However, there is a big issue, is that how many doctors do we have? So the number of people is the other big item of the planning procedure. So sometimes if the government is accepting higher growth in case of, for example, wages, it might lead to a situation when actually they are trying to reduce the number of people in the public sector to keep the budget under control. Some methodologies. These are the most famous ones, and they invented somewhere in the 70s. And actually most of them regarding, probably all of them was invented by actually the military in the United States. So it's quite strange that in the military budget, to have a long-term predictability and long-term stability of the budget, the military expenditures are the case that such kind of methodologies seemed important. The first one is the so-called ZBB, the zero-based budgeting system, which actually sounds very nice, very promising. It means that we have to forget about that what was the case so far. We don't care about the past, but we are trying to analyze and define that how much money do we need, for example, to send one person to the moon. Or for example, we would like to have a very nice university, which is actually having maybe 1,000 students, and this university should be the top 10 university in the world. Or we would like to set up a hospital which is actually treating, let's say, 20,000 patients a year, and they would like to have all kind of hospital services with the best doctors all over the world. So you are defining a kind of job, and after that, from scratch, you are trying to build up how much money or how much resources, and of course, as a consequence of that, how much money do you need to set up a project which is taking a man to the moon, or how much money do you need to set up a world-class university or hospital. So you are starting that you need a building with I don't know how many classrooms. You need how many professors. You need how many nurses. You need how many doctors. You need a lot of copy machines. You need a lot of computers. And And of course you have to calculate, if you have 1,000 students, you can decide, do you want to provide a computer to every student, or they can buy on their own and you don't care about it. For example, you are inviting the best professors from all over the world who are asking a lot of money as their wages, or you are inviting people who are not that bad, but much cheaper. Or you are inviting guest professors who are not asking money, for example, for their lectures. So from scratch, you are building up the budget of that project or that institution. So it really sounds promising and very nice. But what could be the danger or the big trap of such kind of approach? Do you have any idea? What is the trap? Why not everybody is using that zero-based budgeting system?
What's going to mess it do that for you quickly?
Exactly, the first one is that it's not easy. So I was just talking 2-3 minutes how to set up a hospital, but for example, a real world-class hospital to set up, it's a huge project. Actually, you can go down to the very tiny details that what kind of cables you should get from one place to the other, what kind of electricity cables, what kind of IT cables, what kind of water, sewage, whatsoever. So it's a massive work to actually plan a hospital from scratch. This is a very good argument.
How to prevent that the actors do not use the actual numbers from former years? Because even if we say that we want to have zero-based budgeting, we can hardly prevent that some people may use old numbers.
That's very good. And just turning a little bit the argument that, okay, we are talking about this university. So does it mean to have the idea to set up a university like Central European University if we would start it from scratch, buying from a plot, buying the building and or building the whole university? Of course it doesn't make sense because we have this whole building structure we already have. So it would be of course maybe nice that a greenfield investment somewhere out of Budapest, it would be quite cheap probably to build this university like Csaba, Central European University. But it doesn't make too much sense because Csaba is here in the 5th district of Budapest, so you don't have really the alternative to build it up from scratch. Further on, and that's probably the most important argument, that who is able to do this zero-based budgeting? The minister, the prime minister, the state secretary and the minister of finance, or the education minister, or the education bureaucracy in the ministry. Do they exactly know how much nurse we need in a good hospital, for example, at the psychological department or in the surgery department? Of course, they might have some idea of that. The answer is, of course, no. They have no idea. They don't know the technical details. They don't know the building itself, what we are talking about. So actually, if you would like to run a zero-based budgeting program, because it's a massive work, it's really a massive project, only the planning, we have to rely on those people who are actually on the field and who are working on that university, on that hospital, on that research institute. So, for example, if you get the job that you have to build or you have to plan your own flat, and you don't feel that you have a budgetary constraint, of course you will have very good ideas. You will go to probably the best design shops, buying the best furniture, probably buying the best TV, probably buying all the Apple stuff, which is probably the most expensive one, or maybe Bang & Olufsen hi-fi you will buy. So actually, if you are relying on those people who are interested to have the best hospital, they will have a plan at the end of the day which will cost probably twice, 3 times, 4 times more than what we are actually spending on that story. Is that clear what I'm talking about? So if you are relying on those people who are interested in that institution or in that project, and of course you cannot blame them, they would like to have the best hospital in the world. So they will have probably twice as many doctors as today, twice as many nurses as today, probably they will get a decent salary, and why you should say that they didn't deserve that? But of course, at the end of the day, they will come up with twice as the budget as previously. Of course, the budget cannot afford that. So zero-based budgeting looks a very nice approach, but on real world, it's quite rare that in any country, countries they are using that extensively. So zero-based budgeting sometimes used, but it's never the main approach of the budgetary planning. PPPS, planning, programming, budgeting system. That's much more common actually, and that's invented in the US as well. And it's actually focusing on projects in the budget. The whole thinking of that methodology started that if you are financing institutions, in that case actually you have no idea what performance they are providing and what kind of task, what kind of projects they are implementing. So you might finance institutions without really knowing that what are they doing, what kind of services they are actually providing. Of course, in case of a hospital or a university, it will be quite difficult to say that, okay, we have a hospital, but they are not doing anything. However, for example, we have a very nice new hospital in Hungary, the so-called military hospital, which is actually providing services to civilians as well. It cost huge amount of money, it was very expensive, and it's the most modern hospital probably in Hungary and in Budapest. And right now their capacity is only used around at the level of 50%. Does it make really sense? Not really. So very much this institution-based approach was criticized. So this is why I invented that more and more we should rely on projects, programs. So even if we have an institution, what kind of programs they are doing, what kind of projects they are implementing, and the whole planning approach would be based on this project, program-based approach. In some cases, I think it's absolutely applicable, and this is where, for example, really the military approach and thinking is a good one, because how they are thinking. Of course, in case of a hospital, you have to provide the day-to-day services. And you have some projects that they would like to set up, maybe a new psychological department, or maybe they would like to have a new investment for some machines and things like that. But most of their activities, the day-to-day health services. But in case of military, and mostly in the US, they are thinking of new military equipment, new military programs. Or for example, a war in Iraq, a war in Afghanistan. Or for example, a new program that inventing a new, very good, let's say, plane system or fighter system. So these kind of projects that they would like to invent some new military equipment, it's very much really project and program based. So they would like to develop the F-16, 25 new fighters, the generals and the military people are actually defining what kind of requirements these fighters should meet. For example, 2,000 km per hour, the speed. They should have, I don't know what kind of guns or whatsoever. And after that, they have a program. They are trying to identify the budget, and maybe it takes 10 years to really develop this F-25 fighter. So in the budget, the program will be calculated, the program will be shown up, and when the military people is actually develop the fighter, the program will be closed, and they will start maybe another one.
But then if you again have ministers deciding what program to undertake, how do they know that it's actually high priority?
Sorry?
How would the minister know whether a program is high priority or not?
It's actually, it might be decided by the ministers, it might be decided by the government, it might be decided by the parliament. So in case of military, probably there are some strategic papers which may be decided by the government or by the President of the United States or the Prime Minister or maybe the Parliament, that what kind of priorities they have. They are picking up the programs what they would like to implement, and when they have the programs, the goals, after that the planning is coming.
But isn't there the same competence problem? I mean, because again, a minister or government, whoever wouldn't know what's the most urgent.
Absolutely. Your point is absolutely valid, that the more and more in the planning procedure we are relying on those people who are interested. So if you are asking the military people that what kind of military equipments they need all over the world, you will find that they will identify. First of all, apart from the US, all generals all over the world, they would like to have the best equipments like the US have. Probably the Iraq generals, the Russian generals, the Chinese generals, they are always telling to their bosses that, hey guys, the US has such kind of new military equipment, we need the same one, otherwise we are lost. And of course they are buying or not buying that argument. They have enough money or they don't have enough money to have the same one. They might steal. Sometimes we have such kind of situation when Russians are stealing or Israelis or Americans are stealing. Everybody in the military world, probably everybody is trying to spy on the others and stealing all the secrets. But at the end of the day, for example, some people says that the socialist world has actually collapsed because Mr. Ronald Reagan has initiated the so-called Star Wars programs. They initiated very serious military investments, and actually the Russians, the Soviet Union, couldn't really keep the pace. They actually lost the competition on the military world, and that was one of the main reasons that why they have lost, or why the whole socialist system has collapsed. So, but you are absolutely right that that's a very important issue. And third one is performance budgeting. That sounds promising as well. In case of a hospital, if they are providing 100 surgery per month, they are receiving 1 million for every surgery. If they are providing 200 surgery, in that case, 200 times 1 million for it. So somehow the budgeting system is trying to measure the performance, and after that, actually the real financing is based on that. So in that case, you have to set the price, and you have to somehow control, keep the performance under control, and in that case, you can really calculate the budget. So back to the basics. There are situations when, for example, zero-based budgeting could be a good approach. It's usually in those cases when you want to set up a new institution or a new task in the budget. So when in real world, you actually really have to start from scratch, because you are really doing something completely new. In that case, zero-based budgeting methodology could be a good one. When you have lots of programs and projects in the budget, in that case, the PPPS could be a good one. And there are other areas, and health system, the education system, where somehow you are trying to measure the performance, and actually the budgeting and the planning system is trying to based on that performance and trying to use that as a planning method and as a financing method. And of course, I already mentioned it a number of times. So we have these very nice methodologies, but at the end of the day, usually the previous year is the basis for the budgeting. I already mentioned that planning procedure is actually deciding most of the main issues regarding the budget, and it's very much because the budget system is quite inflexible. There is a lot of expenditures and probably some revenues where when you have decided the main criteria, the main elements, after that you don't have too much room for maneuvering. So for example, if you have a fixed rate, a fixed interest rate in case of government debt, in that case you can calculate even forint or dollar or euro, single forint euro error of margin, that how much money you have to spend on the interest payments. Or for example, if you have a system for the indexation of the pensions, if you have a good projection on how many pensioners we have and how many people will retire, with a very low error of margin, you can calculate, for example, the pensions. Wages. If you know how many doctors, how many nurses we have, you can calculate very easily how much money we have to spend on the wages of those people. Or if you have an investment project, maybe it's a military project, maybe building up and setting up a new hospital or a new theater. You have the project plan, you have the investment plan, you know how much money you have to spend on that specific year to have the inauguration, celebration before the election. So many elements of the budget. When you have decided during the planning procedure that how much money you would like to spend on those items, after that the room for maneuvering, the flexibility is very small. So probably 70–80% of the budget is actually decided during the planning procedure, and this is why during the year it's very difficult to change really the budget system, the budgetary, the fiscal policy. And further on, which creates another issue with the fiscal policy, that if you would like to initiate austerity measures during the year, usually austerity measures has an extra spending effect on the short run. So it could be another trend. So if you want to fire, let's say, 10,000 doctors, you have to pay maybe 6 months, 8 months, 10 months severance payments to those people, because that's the rule of the game, and I think it's absolutely probably fair that you have to pay something for those people who will lose their jobs. Or if you want to, for example, shut down, in Hungary we had uranium mining during the 70s and the 80s. And it was really a loss-making project. It was a state company. So for example, when they have shut down the mine, maybe 5–10 years still down the road, the budget was financing the closing cost of the mine. So we didn't have to pay we didn't have to cover the large losses which was created by this uranium mine, but still another 10 years we had to find the shutdown cost, which was pretty expensive. So on the very short run, usually the budget, the fiscal policies is very difficult to change. And if you are just watching the last 4 years, the fiscal crisis in many countries in Europe, you will see the same one, that on the very short run, it's very difficult to change completely fiscal policy. And let's say from -8% to get to plus, let's say 1% in the budget, because all of this inflexibility. And don't mention the political element of the stories, that of course if you would like to fire 10,000 doctors, it not only means that you have to pay a lot of severance payment, but further on we are talking about 10,000 people who might have a family, who are losing actually their living opportunities financially. So of course they will be upset and they will try to do everything to avoid that layoff, which is of course normal. So that's what's happening in Greece, Portugal, and other countries. So now we are continuing with the implementation part. I don't think that there is a big surprise after the previous sentences that during the implementation the budget is quite inflexible. And of course, if we are going ahead in the time, it's getting even more and more difficult. Maybe in January, if you are initiating changes in the budget, it might have an effect on the second half of the year, because the extra spending might maybe expire, so you might save some money. But for example, in July, September, October, you are not really able to really change the budget for that year. It's very difficult for you. If you see that in October, that your fiscal deficit will be maybe 3% higher than it was originally planned and expected, you have hardly any chance to compensate for that overrun in 2 months' time. First of all, you need some plans how to compensate that extra deficit. After that, you need a decision making. Maybe it takes 2, 3, 4 months. Maybe the government is enough, but maybe you need the parliament approval. And you have to implement, you have to initiate new regulations, new rules, new laws. You need some time to be effective. So if you start something in October, you might be sure that probably middle of December when you can really start to do something. So it's actually not really possible. So that's why I believe that reserves could be important in the budget. How much reserve you are building into the budget, and it might help the room for maneuvering. So I think reserves are necessary in the budget because of 2 aspects. First of all, there could be events or issues what you couldn't really see before the budget planning. So for example, the best example for that is natural catastrophe. You cannot really know that an earthquake or maybe an oil catastrophe in the Gulf or a big nuclear catastrophe like Fukushima is going to happen. So you cannot prepare for that in the budget, but you might put a reserve in the budget that if you have something which was not predictable, you might use that money for to compensate or to deal with that issue. So this is one part. The unpredictable events, you need some money to finance for that issue. So that's one reason to have reserves. The other is that if you believe that macroeconomics is very uncertain, market is changing very rapidly, GDP growth scenarios are very uncertain, very unpredictable. In that case, probably it's better to build in a large reserve in the budget. And of course, if everything is going very well, you might always find something to spend on the money. Politicians will love to do that. But if GDP is going to be smaller than expected, if interest rates are going to be higher than expected, if you have to pay more to the doctors and the nurses because they are on strike, so you need to raise their wages to start their job again, etc., etc. So in that case, large reserves could help you not to lose the control on fiscal policy. Incentives, interest, responsibility.
As for reserves, two questions. Well, what would you call sufficient in terms of GDP? Or, and the other thing, what is usual across countries? What do they do?
There are countries, so usually what is normal to have some reserve for these unpredictable issues like natural catastrophe and drought and things like that. It could be maybe 2-3% of the total budget. It's probably less than 0.5% of the GDP. That's not a very big one, that could be a lot. But recently, I think it's getting more and more important to have preparations for the macroeconomic issues, and in those cases, I think the minimum 1% would be needed, between 1 or 2%, 1.5%. But there is no rule of thumb of that. But let's say 0.1% is definitely not enough. So I think over 1% would be the minimum. So, incentives, interest. Of course, when the budget is approved and the implementation is starting, you have to somehow ensure two important parts of the whole story. First of all, you have to, and I'm a budget people, so probably I put it's number one, you have to keep the budget under control. That's one. Second one, from the available budget, you have to provide the services why the budget was allocated. And sometimes it's not easy. Because if you don't have enough money, or maybe the implementation is not efficient, or simply the people don't know how to really manage the budget. So there could be conflicts between keeping the budget, not overrun the budget, and providing actually the services in an efficient way. That's not easy. And there could be different incentive schemes for that. And sometimes, and this is where we are coming back to the, I think it was a big slide, that how strong is the budgetary constraint. If the budgetary constraint is weak in a fiscal system, it not only means that during the planning procedure it's difficult to keep the budget under control, but it usually means that during the implementation. In that case, the players of the whole budget procedure probably will not care if they are overrunning the budget, because somehow it will be solved. I had a very good friend, and he passed away many years ago already, and he worked for the IMF and he was traveling all over the world. And in the 70s he has visited some African country, and there was a dictator or a king or something like that who he was talking to. And he asked the guy that, oh, Mr. I don't know who, how do you ensure that the budget is under control and your people are not overspending the budget? They are not spending more than it was approved. It's easy. If someone is spending more, I will get them executed. Okay, so that's quite easy. Maybe in democratic countries it's maybe not that common, or it's not a good alternative. But how can you ensure that the budget is not overspent? That's not easy in many countries. But of course, if someone believes that if he is overspending the budget and will be fired, probably they will be a little bit more cautious to spend more than it was expected. Further on, during the implementation, what would you like to follow? What would you like to really keep under control? So for example, in my company, I'm in charge of approving lots of invoices. So for example, I'm getting an invoice that someone was using a taxi from Váci 99 to the 5th district. What can I do with that? Actually nothing. The guy was already using the taxi, he already got the invoice, money was actually paid because he used the card. I'm just approving or someone is sending me a bill that he was traveling to, let's say, to Miami, or maybe to London, to Frankfurt, or Amsterdam. I don't have too much room for maneuvering. So if you really would like to keep the fiscal policy under control, you have to control more the commitments. So for example, if I would be able to control that one guy would like to travel from Váci 99 to the 5th district by cab, in that case I could really control the taxi cost of the company. Of course it doesn't make really rational to do that. But in the budgetary system, the more and more you can control the commitment side of the budget, the better the chance that you can control the whole budget spending. Because, for example, someone took the commitment that 2 billion forints should be spent on IT in an institution, and they contracted the 2 billion forints the project. In that case, you are already in the pipeline. You cannot really return. You have a contract with Oracle, with SAP, with Microsoft, or whatsoever, that you have to spend 2 billion forints on softwares from these companies. So later on, when you will receive the invoice and you have to pay the money, you don't have really too much alternatives. You have to pay the invoice. So if you believe that the 2 billion forint is too much for softwares, in that case, we have to somehow control the commitment side, the contracting period. So that's very important in the implementation, that it's not about controlling the invoices, but it's controlling the commitments. And regarding the commitments, for example, how many people we have? If we are employing 159 doctors in a hospital, in that case, it's pretty clear that how much money we have to spend on them. So we might be the most rigid guys regarding fiscal policy. But if we have 159 doctors, we have to pay them. No doubt about that. So the commitment part is very important. Further on, it's a very nice game, usually at the end of the year, that can you carry forward the estimates, the money, from one year to the other. And depending on the system, it might create very interesting scenarios. In countries where you cannot carry forward the current year estimates, the current year items, what will be the consequence of that? Do you have any idea? I have 100 million forint budget, and I was told, and it's regulated, that if I don't spend that 100 million forint in this year, I will lose that. If I spend only 90 million forint, I save 10 million forint, it will be evaporated, and I will lose it. What will be the consequence of that kind of rule? Come on, it's not that complicated.
Spend it on stupid things.
Exactly. Spend it on anything what is available on the market. I'm working for an advisory company, I told you it already, and sometimes we are receiving interesting tender requests for proposals in middle of December from state institutions, and we don't understand what is this all about. why is this needed so urgently? And after that we are calling some people and somehow we are learning from messages that actually they have 10 million forint extra in the budget and they are afraid of that if they are not spending or not contracting, of course they cannot spend in 2 weeks, but if they are not contracting that 10 million forint or 100, they will lose that money. So they will spend it on even stupid things what they otherwise never thought to be important. So I believe, and there are different ideas, that if we are 100% taking away the budget or the budget savings of any institution at the end of the year, it will lead to that very perverse incentives that they are trying to spend the money on stupid things. And of course, there is 2 aspects of this story. Not only that I will lose the 10 million forint, but there is another aspect. Do you have what could be that? What is the danger if I show that instead of 100 million forint, 90 million forint was again? What will be the consequence of that?
Next year you will get less.
Exactly. If they see that, hey, this guy is very nice, he can solve this problem from 90 million forint, why else we should give them 100 million or 110 next year? So of course they will reduce my budget. Am I crazy to let my budget to be reduced? No, I will spend the money. Of course, so this is this year-end spending bonanza, what I'm saying here. Of course, if there is an automatic carry forward opportunities, in that has another, let's say, difficulties, that it might be complicated. It might be a little bit too complicated after several years. Actually, in Hungary, we have that system that carry forward opportunities are available, and somehow you have to calculate that you have the current year budget and you have the previous year savings. So it makes life a little bit more complicated, but I think it's much better than to have this stupid extra spending ideas. Auditing, measuring. Please.
The former point. Would you agree that it's necessary to allow the respective ministers to spend the savings on whatever purpose they want, or only on the purpose for which it was specified?
I think, so first of all, if the budget is detailed, usually, and you have the investment part, you have the wage part, you have the other services part, so somehow you have to control that why they are spending or on what purpose they are spending on the budget, and you are right that somehow it has to be controlled. But if someone has a budget, he is really in the, or she is in the position to really judge that on what they would like to spend it. But of course, at the end of the year, when you have this year-end spending bonanza, of course they will not say to anybody that this is a stupid reason why you want to spend the money. Just they are trying to invent very nice ideas why they need to spend the money. So it's very difficult, and this next slide is a little bit an answer on that on what and how they would like to spend the budget. Because, and it was clear from the planning story already, that usually those guys who are really in charge of the budget, they can really judge that what is really going on. So the best health minister on earth is not able to really judge the budget or the operation of one hospital. Of course, there could be different methods to judge or measure the performance of a hospital, but really the same information is not available to the government people or to the ministers, to the parliamentary people, what is available for the head of the hospital or for the department heads in the different hospitals. So this is why, and in every institution, but in the budgetary system, there is a so-called auditing and measuring function. First of all, auditing is usually the main principle of the audit of anything is always that the auditor should be independent from the audited institution or person. So that's, I think, the main principle. This is why, for example, in every business organization, the internal audit department is usually, according to the law, they report directly to the supervisory board and not to the management. Of course, how is it working in real life? It's sometimes very mixed. I have very mixed feelings seeing that in the practice. So usually in every democratic country, there is a big state audit office or government audit office, which is actually independent from the administration and reports directly to the parliament. And usually there are rules which somehow guarantees that, for example, the head of that audit office is not a politician and independent from any political party. In normal countries, they are usually following that principle. Of course, in countries where, for example, the parliament is picking up a real party politician to head the state audit office, in that case, the independence of that institution could be questioned, theoretically and in real life as well. But usually, these institutions are independent from the government. And that's, for example, the government would like to have its own audit office, so that would be independent from the ministries and reporting directly to the Prime Minister. And for example, in case of a hospital, they need maybe a 2 persons internal audit group. They should be independent from the financial department, they should report directly to the head of the hospital or maybe to higher level. So independence is very important. The other big issue is with this auditing structure. What is their main purpose? What is their main goal? Usually their task is defined in 2 ways. First of all, they are trying to catch the bad guys, or they are trying to figure out that are there any issues with keeping or meeting the formal requirements and the regulations. So the first function is actually trying to ensure that the institutions are working properly in line with the law. So it's a kind of legal function to see that the institutions are meeting the law and not deviating. And the second one, and that's the problem I think in many countries, that to measure that the budget is spent efficiently or not. And if you are asking yourself that what is the easier, the formal requirements to figure out are much easier. So if you want to find a mistake, or if you want to find accounting mistakes, it's easy because you have an accounting regulation and you can see that they accounted the wages on the wage line or not. It's easy, not easy, but easier. But for example, having a good study that in that specific hospital, probably 20 doctors are not doing actually anything. They should be fired. Or they should actually set up a new department to make the hospital really efficient. Or maybe they should implement a new MIS system. Or maybe they should introduce a new equipment which will be much better for the patients. It's much more difficult. So usually every auditing institution has the role of focusing on the legal requirements, and usually it's expected, theoretically, that they should listen to efficiency issues. They should measure efficiency, but it's much more difficult. In case of Hungary, for example, most of the audit institutions, regardless of the state audit office or the government audit office or the internal audit office, 90–95% of their job is actually focusing on the formal requirements and maybe 5 or 10% on the efficiency stories. But there are other countries where it is probably more important. And this is why, for example, in the US Congress, the Congressional Budget Office, which is separated from the audit office, but they are doing a lot of efficiency-focused analysis and measurement. And of course, corruption, that's quite common in many countries in the state sector. So these auditing institutions should actually explore corruptions as well, which is sometimes not easy. I think we have another 20–25 minutes, a little bit more about tax policy. Actually, after 3+ or 3.5 classes, you might think that I was talking maybe 90% of my time on fiscal policy as a whole and on the about the expenditure side. And of course, expenditures are very important and very difficult to judge, very difficult to define, and lots of people is interested on the expenditure side because they are pensioners, they are civil servants, they are public servants, etc. But we need money to finance that. We need actually revenues, or we need loans to finance the budget. And tax policy is actually the way of implementing the revenue side. And tax policy is not an easy story, and at the beginning I remember I mentioned that budgeting is based on maybe on the revenues, maybe on the expenditures, maybe on the deficit. But tax policy itself could be important and could have an own political aspects and could be tax policy important. So first of all, what is the starting point of tax policy? And it will, of course, define and somehow decide on the whole fiscal policy. Do we want to focus on the deficit part of the fiscal policy via tax policy? Do we want to focus on competitiveness? If you read the nice speeches of the finance ministers in the last 15 years before the crisis, in most of the cases, in case of tax policy, the magic word was usually competitiveness. Or they would like to cover the expenditure side via tax policy, regardless of the effects of the tax policy on the business sector or on the society. So, tax policy could have an independent policy part and could actually decide many important issues or the main fiscal policy stories. And further on, what are the main principles of tax policy? Do we want to focus on solidarity or efficiency? I don't know, have you learned about tax policy considerations? And you can find hundreds of articles about this efficiency and solidarity issues, starting from Mirles and many other people who is actually researching on that. And that's one of the main issues. Of course, the higher the tax in every aspect of the tax system, probably you can prove that it will reduce efficiency and it will reduce performance. If you listen to a little bit to the US tax policy debate, and actually for me, I've seen maybe half of the first debate between Obama and Romney. It was on TV in Hungary. I was surprised that actually they had a tax policy debate on a way which was much more detailed what I ever heard in the Hungarian parliament. They were talking about that if you are paying, if you are imposing higher taxes people on over, let's say, $100,000 per year, and what will be the consequence of that, or if you are reducing or increasing the capital taxes, or if you are increasing the tax of Mr. Warren Buffett and reducing the tax of his secretary, which is a famous story that the secretary paid higher tax rate than Mr. Warren Buffett, and things like that. It was very, very, very detailed discussions on different segments of the society, that how much taxes they are paying. So that was very much in the US. Actually, maybe I mentioned that, or I used to mention during my lectures, that what was the highest tax rate in the world? It was, I think, 98% or 96% after the Second World War, or somewhere around the Second World War in the US. 96%, and some people used to say that I'm wrong because the current government actually introduced the 98% penalty tax on severance payments on the public sector. But still, can you imagine that 96%, or maybe even in the 50s and the 60s there, or 91%? It's famous that Ronald Reagan, I maybe heard the story, Ronald Reagan was an actor before, of course, he became a politician and later President of the United States. And one story, I don't know is it right or not, that why he became a politician, that when he was an actor, usually by April, May, he made so much money that the extra performance, the extra revenue, what he could actually create or generate via taking more roles in films, was maybe, let's say, 90% tax. And he said, no way on earth that I'm going to work and I'm taking the difficult job of a film star and paying 90% tax. So usually after April and May, he stopped and he had a lot of time, and so he started to deal with politics. I don't know is it right or not, but actually Ronald Reagan was one of the guys, he was very much in favor of reducing marginal taxes. And of course the whole literature is actually analyzing that if you have 70, 80, 90% marginal tax, how much is it reducing performance? How much is it giving an incentive not to work, not to generate performance in the economy, in the society? And Mr. Reagan is a prime example. Maybe it's an urban legend, I don't know, but it's very much. Can you imagine if you made a nice, decent amount of money? In Hungarian sense, maybe you made, let's say, $1 million, $2 million. But after that, the next $1 million, you have to pay 90% tax. Will you really work really hard? Not everybody. So that is one aspect. The second one is, if you are listening to the finance minister of any country in the budget speed, we will simplify the tax system. We want to get it as simple as possible, because we believe that complicated tax system is not good to people, not good to the business sector. But again, in case of tax system, it's one of the big issue or big question. How much can you tailor-make the tax system to the society and to the business sector? How much can you really taking into account the different aspects of the society? Do you want to take into aspects at the interest of the pensioners, the doctors, the nurses, the big families, the single families, the workers, the unemployed people? So the more you are trying to somehow adjust via the tax system of the different interests of the society and the business sector, what will be the consequence? A more and more complicated tax system. So it's a big question mark, a big dilemma. If you want to get a very simple tax system, it's easy to implement, but everybody will pay the same taxes, regardless of they have 5 children to raise up, or maybe a single billionaire someone. Or if they are nurses, doctors, pensioners, maybe students, to have an extra work to finance their tuition fee. So it's a big question mark in the business sector. If you have one single flat tax to everybody, it means that, for example, those companies who have monopolies, they have monopole profits, they will pay the same tax rate than like SMEs who has a very competitive situation and they have a very low profit rate. So that's a other big question mark, that simple or complicated.
Sorry, on the efficiency argument, if I might go back, when we're talking about Central and Eastern Europe in particular, isn't there the other argument that basically the higher the tax, the more incentive for people to declare less money, and vice versa. The lower tax, they declare properly. And I think that in Russia, in the 2000s, they actually decreased the tax, but received more tax revenue in this way.
Exactly. That's another important argument, and I don't think it's there. So, the more you are focusing on efficiency, and the more the tax system is simple, it means probably that the better the chance to collect actually the taxes. The more complicated the tax system, the more they are trying to actually focus on the different groups of society and business sector, it probably leads to a situation that actually auditing and measuring the tax commitments are much more difficult. So one of the main arguments supporting flat tax, and that could be another 1 hour to talk about the aspects of the flat tax, and that was the case in Russia and in many countries around Hungary, and even Hungary is actually from next year introducing a real flat tax, because the government is still already saying that this is a flat tax, but that's not the case. But from next year it will be really a flat tax system in Hungary. That while the flat tax is easier to manage and measure the tax commitments and collecting more money, and probably the higher the tax rates, of course, the higher the tax evasion in the economy and the society. So those are the aspects, and I think your point is absolutely valid and important.
Don't share this. We cannot just introduce other taxes because they are more favorable to the population. That will, in the long run, just lead to financial distress of the whole government. So we have to take on the problem that people are not paying taxes, but hoping that they will pay their taxes that they like more.
Some people say that actually tax policy is not really a science or not really policy, but even art. Because you have to generate enough taxes not to give too much counter-incentive to the society, not to give bad incentives in the society, and keeping the whole system quite simple, not too complicated. So there are so many aspects what you have to harmonize that it's really difficult. So you are absolutely right that it's not an easy story. So, however, tax policy looks much more easier than expenditures, because at the expenditure budget you have thousands, 10,000 items, and maybe in the tax budget maybe you have 10, 15, 20. In Hungary we have maybe 55 revenue types, but the real large ones are maybe 10. PIT, VAT, corporate tax, social security contribution, and that stuff. That's usually the case in other countries. I mentioned here is the race to the bottom. What I mean, the tax policy has more an international consequence than, for example, the hospital or the health budget or the education budget. Because tax policy is very much affecting the competitiveness of a country, and however you can see all kinds of competitiveness reports, and all of them is actually ensuring that tax policy is just one part of the competitiveness of a country. So like the highest countries on the World Economic Forum competitiveness report are Switzerland, Sweden, Norway, Finland, Denmark, the Netherlands, Singapore, Hong Kong. These are usually Singapore, Hong Kong, they have very low tax rates. Switzerland, internal tax rates are quite high in Switzerland, just they have very peculiar tax structures for foreigners and foreign companies. But this means that tax policy is not deciding about the competitiveness of a country, but if a country would like to improve the competitiveness, how many years do they need to evaporate corruption? In Hungary, maybe some people would say 100 years is the minimum. How many years you need to set up a new highway system? Maybe 10, 15 years. How many years do you need to set up a good education system or to have a good administration? It might take decades. How many days you need to change the tax system of a country? In case of Hungary maybe 90 days. In some other countries maybe 100, 120. So tax policy has the beauty regarding competitiveness that you can change tax policy much more quickly than the other competitiveness factors. So this is why tax policy is in the focus of this competitiveness race, and this is why the EU actually invented this race to the bottom principle, that countries are reducing their tax rates because they want to compete with the other countries. So when Slovakia has introduced the 19% tax rate for VAT, PIT and corporate tax, that was a message to other countries. And you can see that in the last 10-15 years in the region, countries, most of the countries, they were reducing tax rates because they wanted to be competitive. And the current government is actually trying to do the same and explaining the same. And it's probably interesting or worthwhile to talk a little bit about Hungarian tax policy because it's quite unique, not only the unorthodox economic policy, but one of the main elements is the unorthodox tax policy, which means that the government has started to segment the business sector and they are trying to impose special taxes on the different segments. So they are trying, for example, levy higher taxes on those sectors where they believe they have much more money and they are not crucial regarding competitiveness of the Hungarian economy. So for example, the government is not touching the manufacturing sector, so the car industry, the electronic industry, but for example, imposing heavy taxes on the financial sector, on the energy sector, on the telecom sector, on the retail sector. And these sectors has the beauty, they cannot move out from the country very easily. They have investments, but they cannot really take out from the country too easily. So they cannot really escape from the tax commitments. And further on, the government, Ronald Reagan had again a famous saying that whenever something is moving, the government is tending to tax it. It was much better, the sentence, but the meaning that the government has the behavior that if they see something, they try to tax it. Now, so I think the Hungarian government was actually reading that nice sentence, because in Hungary we have introduced taxes on financial transactions. It's a little bit similar to the so-called Tobin tax, but it's much higher than anywhere else in the world. They are, for example, taxing phone calls. Every phone call you are paying a tax in Hungary. I don't know have you realized it or not. They are taxing pipelines and channels, telecom, energy, all kind of pipelines. You have to pay taxes, not you but the companies who are utility lines. Unhealthy food products, the so-called chip tax. So for example, if you are buying Red Bull or if you are buying chips, you have to pay taxes. So actually the government is very creative, that they are trying to tax all kind of things, whatever they can.
If we raise taxes on the financial sector,